This week saw the launch of the Britain Stronger in Europe campaign. That's the case for keeping Britain as a member of the European Union ahead of a future referendum to be held sometime before 2017. Janan Ganesh, what did you learn from this week's events? We have Lord Rose, former head of Marks and Spencer, the famous retailer, heading the campaign.
Well, one of the problems with the In campaign is they have no undisputed political figurehead yet. So they've got people from business, like Lord Rose. They have good organisers, Will Straw, former Labour parliamentary candidate. They even have June Sarpong, who was on the telly 15 years ago as their sort of bit of celebrity glamour. What they don't have is the equivalent of, say, Nigel Lawson, who is helping to lead...
The former Chancellor of the Exchequer under Margaret Thatcher.
Exactly, who's helping to lead the campaign in favour of exit. They don't have a political figurehead as of yet. Now, my guess is that when the referendum is eventually called, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, whoever the official figurehead is, becomes the de facto face and voice for the In campaign. But until they get that, there's a slight vacuum, I think, between the in campaign and the Out campaign in terms of political clout.
And David Cameron is saying, please take it on trust, wait until I come back with a good deal negotiated with my EU partners, all 27 of them, on new terms for British membership of the European Union. What can you tell us so far about how the negotiations are going?
Well, what I can tell you is that a big chunk of David Cameron's own party are already dissatisfied with the things that he's asking for. So the things he's asking for are protection for non-Euro countries when it comes to voting weights and institutional power within the EU, particular protection for Britain's critical industry, which is financial services, and then lots of symbolic stuff like writing Britain out of things like the commitment to ever closer union, codifying the fact that the euro is only the currency of the Eurozone and not the whole of the European Union. All of those sort of symbolic and substantial measures are what he's touring Europe to try and extract from all these other governments, but his own party don't think it's quite enough.
And is that going to help with the great British public, saying that we're no longer going to be part of an ever closer union, which is, by the way, in the Treaty of Rome, 1958?
I'm not sure your average voter cares about the language of the renegotiation. I think ultimately what they care about is immigration, and there's nothing in his bill of requests that seems to directly solve that problem. You can't see numbers falling massively as a result of everything he's asking for. Even if he maxes out and gets 100% of his negotiating positions, it's hard to see how British migration flows fall. And so your average punter might actually look at this and think it's not speaking to me.
What about the case for remaining in the European Union on economic terms in pounds? I almost said shillings and pence here, with the old retailer's hat on, but there is an economic case saying if we leave, we will be less well off.
Yes, well, the case economically for staying in is that if we leave, we can't guarantee that we're going to have total access to the single market, and if we did have access, it would probably come at the cost of bearing some regulation. And this is the problem that Norway and Switzerland, who are semi-detached from the EU, already have. They have partial access to the market, but they do bear a lot of regulations from the EU and have very little to no say at all over those regulations. And the EU, I don't think, ever has an incentive to let a country as large as Britain access its internal market while sparing it entirely from the burden of labour laws, product regulation and so forth.
What about the polls? Are the Brexit, the No campaign in effect, are they in the lead at the moment?
No, I think the campaign to stay in has a fractional lead, but that was a much wider lead not long ago. So over the summer things did close, and I would put that down to the migration stories emanating from Calais to do with Syrian and Eritrean refugees. Now, technically it doesn't have a lot to do with European free movement, and those migration flows would exist regardless of the EU, but it's conflated in the public mind with the idea of free movement. The polls have narrowed. I think it's a temporary blip, and that really the underlying position is the country will grudgingly vote to stay in.
But not at the same level as 1975, when 2/3 of Britons voted in a referendum after the then Prime Minister Harold Wilson came back with a new deal for Britain. 2/3 voted yes to British membership of the then common market.
Yeah, I don't think the margin will be anything quite as large as that. The parallel I always draw is the Scottish referendum on independence this time last year. 55% voted to preserve the union, 45% voted to break it up. I can imagine the EU referendum ending with a similar result, actually, in 2017 or whenever it's held.
And now there are some people, perhaps of a wistful persuasion, who say if we have a referendum by 2017 on a new deal for Britain and Europe, that will settle everything. That will be the end of the affair. What do you think, Janan?
1975 referendum you alluded to was a conclusive vote to stay in. 8 years later, the opposition party, Labour, campaigned on a manifesto promise to leave. These referendums never settle anything, and I think whether we vote to stay in or vote to leave, we'll end up with some kind of British fudge. We're already separated from the core by our currency, and that will continue indefinitely, I think.
Not a fork in the road, as you wrote eloquently this week, but it's actually a roundabout with no exits. Janan Ganesh, thank you very much.
Thank you.